Welcome, friends. This is Economic Update, a weekly program designed to bring analysis and understanding of major economic trends and developments that are in the news and that are important to everybody who borrows money, lends money, works at a job, has investments, worries about the prices of things and wages and all of that. My name is Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life. I currently teach at the New School University in New York City. I also write columns of economic analysis for truthout.org, a remarkable independent source of news and analysis that I think you'll find interesting. You can find them at truthout.org. Let me also, before we jump into today's material, ask you to continue sending me your comments, your questions, your criticisms. They're very helpful in shaping how we structure this course, I almost said, being a teacher, this program, and what questions we select from the many we get to answer toward the end. You can send your comments and criticisms through my website, rdwolff.com, or through the website of our project, democracyatwork.info. Either of those websites will allow you to send us whatever communications you wish, and we read every single one of them. I also want to stress that both websites contain much material that elaborates and extends and documents items discussed on this program, so that if you're interested in pursuing them in all kinds of ways, let me urge you again to go to those websites, because that's how you can do that at your own leisure, when and how you wish. rdwolff.com and democracyatwork.info. That's how you can find out more, what we're doing. You can be supportive, which we would appreciate, and it'll help this whole project move forward. I want to begin the updates today with something that has been tragically in the news over the last couple of weeks. It was the collapse in Dhaka, Bangladesh, the other side of the world from us. A building collapsed, and that building housed many garment factories, workshops and factories that produce clothing. When I first brought this to your attention, we were told that there were 70 or 80 people who had died in the collapse of that building. The numbers kept growing, and by the latest count that I saw, it's over 400 people died, workers in the garment factories, with hundreds more injured, some seriously. This is a catastrophe of major proportions. A little later in the program, we're going to talk about how factory inspection and controls have evolved here in the United States. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about the meaning of the tragedy in Bangladesh. In my earlier discussion, I already explained that, in fact, this is common in many, many countries around the world, where factories have settled to take advantage of cheap labor, to take advantage of very lax enforcement of building codes, occupational health and safety rules, quality of the air, environmental conditions. All of those expenses are saved by capitalist businesses in that part of the world so that they can offer their clothing at a cheaper price. And in order to compete with that, American companies located in the United States have for many years closed their factories here and opened them in places like Bangladesh to take advantage of the lax conditions. Now, periodically, a tragedy like this happens. And then there's a lot of finger-pointing, a little bit of soul-searching, and pretty much everything goes back to normal. And by the way, let me mention some of the names in the news of companies you're familiar with who utilize factories like the ones that fell apart in this building, or perhaps even including some of those who lost people's lives in the process. Disney, Walmart, Gap, Many other names, but those I thought might draw your attention, and they've been all over the news. How do you deal with this problem? You pass another law, pointless, they're not enforced. You impose another regulation, pointless, there's no follow-up. In fact, the market pressure, and here's one of those things markets do that ought to make you think twice about them. Market pressure leads businesses to pay low wages, leads building builders to scrimp on the quality of what they produce. It leads to these disasters. A serious solution would have to create in the workplace a group of people with a powerful incentive to make sure these conditions never happen again. And there are only two ways to do that. Number one, let there be powerful unions. At least then there's a chance that workers represented by unions will make the kinds of complaints and point out the kinds of weaknesses that could prevent this from happening. Second possibility, shift from capitalist enterprises where the people who own them are far away in a luxurious suburb and don't care and don't want to spend the money to create safe workplaces. Change over to workers' enterprises, workers' co-ops, enterprises run by the workers in them, because they're not going to kill themselves. If you want workers to be safe, you got to give workers the chance to make the place safe. Otherwise, you're being a cynical faker about your concern for such tragedies. Our second update today is remarkable. It's remarkable because it's about a group of courageous doctors. In this case, cancer doctors, to be more precise, doctors who specialize in cancers of the blood. In the Journal of the American Society of Hematology, the latest issue, name of the journal is called Blood, so you can look it up and find it. There is an appeal by a group of leading cancer specialists, specialists in cancer of the blood, from around the world. One of their leaders is University of Texas, Dr. Hagop Kantarjian, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who's at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. This article appeals to the drug companies to bring down the prices of the drugs. Many cancer drugs, including the one for chronic myeloid leukemia, which is the one this article's about, but it's only a sample of many drugs. This drug costs over $100,000 a year to administer. It's extremely successful. This drug has brought down the rate of dying from this cancer from a very serious number to a very small number. All people need is to get it, but they're not getting it because they can't afford it. Under many union and other medical insurance programs, the cost of this kind of cancer drug is borne in part by the individuals who get it under the current regime. 25 to 30% of the disposable income of people who get these drugs is used to pay their part of it. That's why an increasing number are not using it. People are dying all over the world because of these high prices. And they're not high prices everywhere. In Europe, the prices of these drugs are much lower than they are, for example, in the United States because of the national health services in those countries which bargain with the drug companies and get a lower price. But here are doctors in the latest issue pleading, begging for the drug companies to reduce the prices because it's a matter of life and death to people already suffering from cancers. This is a major problem. Drug costs in the United States are out of control, just like the profits of drug companies. And if we want to control these things, we have to go to the source of the problem, which is the private enterprise in the drug business that pushes the price as high as the market will bear. And if you're a desperate cancer patient, that price, as you can see, can run you over $100,000 a year. There's something fundamentally wrong and indeed immoral about allowing these kinds of prices to go unchallenged. My next update has to do with another outrage, if you permit me, and that is the level of pay for the top officials of our corporations, the CEOs. Chief Economic Officer. Wow. Let's see. Over the last week, we've had two reports, one by the Bloomberg Financial Services that says in the top 500 or so of corporations, the CEO gets around 204 times what the average worker gets. The AFL-CIO also released its study, a regular study they put out. They had the number at 354 times. Wow. What a gap. The top people are paid hundreds of times what other people get. This produces extraordinary inequality of income and wealth in the United States. And the statistics show it's gotten worse since 2009. In other words, during a crisis, largely brought on by the CEOs of banks and other large corporations, their gap between what they get and what their average workers get has gotten bigger. They were not only not punished, they are being rewarded by the crisis they brought. And the society suffers the anger, the resentment, the tension. Workers whose pay isn't kept up are the ones that have to go into debt, to do without, maybe even without their cancer drugs. Meanwhile, the CEOs keep getting bigger and bigger pay packages. This is an outrageous way to take a society through a difficult economic time. All that discussion of we have to tighten our belts, we all have to pull together. They're not pulling together. They're getting more and more. And it is something that Americans ought to be concerned about. And they have been. The Dodd-Frank bill that was passed 2 or 3 years ago to reform issues like this had a clause in it that passed, and President Obama signed it. And it says corporations will now have to announce what the ratio is between what the CEO gets and what people at the bottom get, so that everybody knows, and so that shareholders can vote against giving even more money to the top CEOs. But guess what? Even though the law is 3 years old, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was charged with writing the regulations required by the law, hasn't gotten around to it. And here's a statistic I thought you might be interested in. Why did the Securities and Exchange Commission not already write the regulations to enforce the Dodd-Frank bill's requirement that corporations say what the gap is between their top paid people and those at the bottom? Well, it turns out that there's a lobbying group in Washington, and it is devoted to preventing this from happening. And among the people who are on and supporting that are, I thought you'd be interested to know, by the way, the name of the group, if you're interested, is the HR Policy Association. One of those wonderful names that tells you absolutely nothing. But what the HR Policy Association does is lobby the Securities and Exchange Commission and other branches of the government not to do what the Dodd-Frank law says has to be done. And I thought you'd be interested, among the executives that sit on this HR Policy Association, according to Bloomberg, General Electric Company, whose ratio from the top to the bottom is 491 times, McDonald's Corporation, whose ratio is 351 times, and the AT&T Corporation, whose ratio is that the guy at the top gets 339 times what the guy at the bottom does. 339. You know what that means? That means the guy at the top gets in 1 day what the guy at the bottom gets in 1 year. Last short update for today. Goes back to my story about Bangladesh and buildings collapsing and working people dying through no fault of their own, through the negligence, the greed, and the market mechanisms that drive industry to move to countries like Bangladesh. We have a story here in the United States that I want to tell you also about the same issue. It was late April, back in 1971, that the United States passed a law. Actually passed it a few months before that. It went into effect in April of 1971. Occupational Safety and Health Administration was set up. For the first time, the federal government was systematically going to make sure that job sites were safe and healthy for American working people. Here's some of the achievements over the years of the OSHA administration, as it's called, OSHA. In 1970, we had 18 deaths per 100,000 workers in the United States in a year. By 2006, that number had been reduced to 4.1 deaths per 100,000 workers. True, part of that is because we don't produce in the United States manufactured, dirty workplaces where you get your hands greasy and where there's a lot of danger. We don't have them the way we used to because we've sent them to places like Bangladesh. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But it worked. We had a system that allowed trade unions and concerned workers to make complaints, to secure inspections, to actually make a difference in a systematic way. And the union movement in the United States took a lot of leadership in making that law function. And it worked. It saved lives, thousands of them. But here's the irony, but it's also how capitalism works. Because OSHA was successful, businesses were required to spend money to clean the air, spend money to make the machines safer, spend money to make work conditions better. It cost them something, and they didn't want to pay. But it's the law here in the United States. So guess what they did? And this is how capitalism as a system works. They left. They left the United States not only because the wages of workers elsewhere were cheaper, true enough, but also because they didn't have to worry about occupational safety and health laws, inspectors, and administration, none of it. They could save money there. So guess what? The Occupational Health and Safety Act, designed to protect workers, protected American workers, but suddenly thrust workers in other parts of the world into the kinds of spectacularly dangerous workplaces we've just witnessed in Bangladesh. The market drove businesses to escape occupational health and safety here in order to dump death and destruction on workers elsewhere. We need to question a system in which the success of a group of workers in making a workplace safe doesn't spread everywhere right away because all workers want and need to be safe. But instead, given our peculiar economic system, the very success of American workers in becoming safer subjected workers elsewhere to horrible, dangerous, and destructive conditions. I'm going to turn now to a more interesting discussion about today and this week. May Day, 1st of May, is a holiday across the world. Practically in every country, there are demonstrations, parades, all kinds of events, often led by labor unions, often led by political parties that represent working people. And it has to do with celebrating something, ironically, that happened in the United States back in 1886. So an event that happened in America on Labor Day, which was then May 1st, is celebrated everywhere but in the United States. Here, because of the scary idea that workers had a holiday for them, May Day was written out of our holiday calendar. And we instead moved Labor Day, a different name, to September. Interesting story. But May Day is also an occasion for us to remember what labor unions have been, what labor struggle has been, and what it could and should be today. So I want to devote a good bit of time today to talking about the labor movement, what has happened to it, what it could be, what it once was, and what it could be again. It's a topic I brush up against, but many of you have asked me to deal with it with some focus, and that's what we're going to do today. First, isn't it interesting that there was a holiday on May 1st back then? What were labor unions fighting for then? They were fighting for something that had a lot of people being their allies. They were fighting for something that was important for every working person. They did not just fight for something that their members would get. Keep that thought in mind. Back in 1886, the issue was the length of the working day. How many hours in an average day would a worker be required to work? In the early days of capitalism, 16-hour days, 12-hour days, 10-hour days were the norm, were typical, sometimes even more. In England, the phrase became famous, the beds never get warm, because one member of the family would be sleeping when another one came back for work, and then the one who had been sleeping would have to go out, and the bed never got cold because of the endless numbers of hours that everybody in the family had to work. So workers had to fight long, bitter, difficult fights to get the working day down to what it is now, legally 8 hours, even though many workers work much more than that. Some get paid overtime, many don't. But the 8-hour day was established. And it's interesting that in those days, labor unions were strong because they took on big social issues. Average people who weren't in a union were able to see, month after month, that the movement, the organization that was pushing for things good for all working people, and they are the majority, were being led by unions, were led by labor movements, were sometimes led by political parties that identified themselves as labor parties or workers' parties or sometimes socialist parties. But the labor movement was a champion for all working people. Sure, it bargained for its members with their employer, but it also represented a demand for a better society for everybody, union member and non-member alike. Please keep that in mind. Let's fast forward to the Great Depression of the 1930s. That was an important time in the labor movement of the United States, as it was in many countries, because the Depression terrified people with the threat of losing their jobs. So many people were unemployed around them, with the threat of losing their homes, because without a job, you couldn't make your mortgage payments, with the threat of illness, you could not afford to go to a doctor, and on and on and on. Workers and working people, employed and unemployed, were desperate. Into that situation came the labor movement. In the United States, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was what they called themselves. And they set about a crusade. It's really the right word. They were going to move across the United States and bring unions to the American people with a simple argument. The union, together with other workers unified, the union is your best bet to get through this depression with less damage to your life, your family, your neighborhood, your home, than you can on your own. The labor movement is, if you allow me the term, the vanguard, pulling everybody, gathering everybody together, focusing everybody to get the kinds of changes that will help everybody. And the labor movement got the support of millions of people. That's why millions of people joined labor unions in the 1930s, the way they never had before in American history, and in a way they never have since. because the labor movement then was a social movement. Or to be more accurate, the labor movement, representing workers at a workplace, allied itself with all kinds of people's movements demanding a better society, including then the socialist and communist parties in the United States, at least. And it worked. Not only did millions of people join the labor movement in the United States, itself a major achievement. Not only did that happen, not only did the labor movement grow spectacularly by being allied with a larger social movement, but so was the success of the labor movement much greater because it had those allies, because politicians could see not just the union and its resources, but also the millions of people, not in the union, but allied with the union, looking for the union's leadership, supporting the union, whether it was in a strike or whether it was in a campaign for a new law or whether it was in a campaign around elections. Here's an example, quick list, of what was achieved when unions and allied social forces got together. Social Security. Roosevelt basically said it in the middle of the 1930s. He created the Social Security system and got it through the United States Congress because the labor movement and its allies wielded so much influence and power, power at the ballot box, power in the street, that something had to be done to meet their demands or else the society would fall apart. All the American people got Social Security, but the labor movement, building its alliance with others in the society, they're the ones that made it happen. We got unemployment compensation for all workers without jobs. We got a minimum wage law. We got a law through that recognized unions and their right to exist and represent their workers. And perhaps most spectacularly, we got a federal jobs program that put millions of Americans who wanted to work back to work. What stunning successes we had when we had a labor movement allied with a larger social movement, whether that be organized as institutions of the community, political parties, or what have you. Well, here we are, 2013. What has happened? After World War II, a big change. The labor movement, for many reasons, decided to create a big distance between itself and the social forces, political parties, organizations, community groups that they had been allied with in the 1930s and even into the early 40s. And slowly, unions became more and more narrowly focused on representing their workers, collectively bargaining with their employer for improved wages and working conditions, or at least preserving their working conditions and wages with their employers. The social movement fell away. Their alliance with the social movement fell away. And what have we had? For the last 50 years, the labor movement in the United States has shrunk every year. Today, less than 7% of workers in the private sector of the United States are in or represented by a labor union. It was once as high as a third, but now 6-point-something%. Unions are small, unions are scarce, and unions are weak. So separating from strong social allies did not help the union movement grow, but it is clearly part of the reason why union shrank. And because that alliance was broken, and because that alliance fell apart, and because many of the social organizations became afraid of taking strong economic positions, and because the unions were afraid to do that and afraid to work with them, the opposition to social change that was progressive, like what Roosevelt did, grew. So here we are, 2013, in the 6th year of a major crisis. We desperately need a strong labor movement, but we don't have one. We desperately need a labor movement allied with social organizations that demand the kinds of things unions want too, but we don't have them. We don't have the organizations, and we don't have an alliance between them and the labor movement. And so this Great Recession, as it's called, is giving us a history completely different from the Great Depression. Then things were done for the mass of people. Social Security, unemployment compensation, minimum wage law, federal jobs program. Today, we're cutting Social Security. We can't even raise the minimum wage to what it was in real terms years ago. No one even discusses a federal jobs program. What a difference. We're going to take our break, as we always do in the middle of the program. I'll be back in a moment to talk about how a new alliance of labor and social organizations could change our history and our country right now. Welcome back to Economic Update. This is your host, Richard Wolff. I want to remind you again that for follow-ups and details on what we cover in this program, please visit rdwolf.com and or democracyatwork.info, where you can get all kinds of information, send us comments, etc., as well as support what we are doing. We were talking about the labor movement, its history on this May Day time of year. I want to turn now to what happens now. The labor movement is much smaller and weaker. Its alliance with social groups that were so successful in the 30s is not here, and the mass of Americans are suffering, as they are in many parts of the world, by austerity programs and other things that wouldn't be possible if a powerful labor and social movement alliance existed. What forms could that take now? Well, let me give you an example drawn from the United States. Why do we not have massive marches, as we did in the 1930s, of unions taking the leadership and inviting everybody else, demanding federal jobs, demanding jobs for people when they've been out of work for years now, when all the president's efforts to get us back to full employment haven't even got us halfway back to the level of unemployment, which was already too high back in 2007. Why aren't there these marches? They would make a difference. They would rally the people. They would build that alliance. We could have allies for the labor movement if it took the leadership. Immigrants from around the country need advocates, need allies. The labor movement is a perfect one. The movement for democracy at work, to build worker co-ops as a safer, better way for human beings to organize the work process, is a growing movement. It can and should be allied with labor movements. I'm going to say a word about that in a moment. And finally, there are the millions of Americans who are upset about the growing inequality in the United States, whether it's something like the Occupy Wall Street movement, focusing on the 1% versus the 99%, or the many other social organizations that are upset about poverty, upset about the gap between rich and poor. The labor movement could be the leader in coming up with plans, strategies, and activities to let folks articulate their views and make demands for change. So it could be done, and it should be done. Let me make, however, a further suggestion for the labor movement, particularly on this May Day time of year. Maybe the labor movement should think about making a change. And it's a change that has already been initiated by one union in the United States, the Steelworkers Union. They entered into an alliance a few years ago with the Mondragon Corporation, Mondragon Cooperative Corporation in Spain, something I've talked about on this program. The Mondragon Corporation is the biggest, most successful worker co-op in the world. It's now the 7th or 8th largest corporation in all of Spain. It is extraordinarily successful. It has grown steadily from its humble beginnings, started by a Catholic priest in the north of Spain in 1956 with 6 people. It now employs over 100,000 people. Very successful, outcompeted no end of capitalist corporations. Why did the steelworkers and Mondragon get together? Well, I don't know what the reasons were. I wasn't at the meetings. But let me suggest a strategy that I think they're working their way toward and that I would recommend in any case. And I've spent my whole life working with labor unions, just so you know. Here's the idea. Unions should have two tracks, two strategies instead of one. The first one is their traditional strategy. Fight with the employer for better wages, more jobs, better working conditions, do the best you can, fight for them, the tradition. But alongside, have another track. And that's what the steelworkers did when they allied with the Mondragon Corporation. In your second track, let the union be a leader in organizing worker co-ops, workplaces, enterprises, where the workers are their own bosses. In the end, that's the dream of every worker in America and much of the world anyway, even those who dare not speak it. Why should the unions do that? Well, here's several reasons. Number one, unions these days are often confronted by a company that gives them a threat. Either you do with lower wages, or you do with poor working conditions, or we leave. We close the factory, we close the office, we close the store, and we go to another state, another country, another continent. The union, faced with what is effectively blackmail, often caves in, fearing to call what may not be a bluff. But now imagine the different situation if the union said, go ahead. We as an institution will help our workers take over your factory that you're abandoning or another one like it, your store, your office. And we'll continue to produce as a workers' co-op. And we'll go to the public and say, you could buy a product from that company, but here's what they did. They left us in the lurch. They went to another place, take advantage of cheaper workers, maybe go into unsafe factories like Bangladesh. We're not going to do any of that. And if you believe in a better situation than what those companies are doing, buy the product from us. We're going to produce. Wow, this would give the union a bargaining chip with the employer they don't have now. It would make unions stronger. And by the same token, if unions were really to get behind worker co-ops, they could provide through their membership some of the money to get those things going. Their funds, their ability to go to members and say, hey, let's kick in so we're able to do this. We're able to make this a possibility in our negotiations. Unions are in a position to buy the support of politicians for these things. Unions are in a position to get their members to buy the products of co-ops and to build them and their success that way. In other words, here's a made-to-order alliance that could show something exciting for the mass of people, workers running their own businesses. At least as exciting as seeing a union successfully do better for its own members. To broaden the union movement, to rebuild alliances, and Lord knows we need them. That's a new two-pronged strategy that I think offers exceptional possibilities. And my hat's off to the Steelworkers Union and Mondragon for showing us the way and helping us to think a new strategy through. In the time remaining on our program, I want to talk about some of the questions and comments you've sent in, as I often do. The first one has to do with a question about workers' self-directed enterprises. That sort of awkward phrase that I use instead of workers' co-ops, because the word co-op has lots of different meanings, and I really want to focus on a work situation where the workers are their own board of directors. When I talk about this, about creating such enterprises, making transitions to such enterprises, people sometimes raise the question, is this really an alternative to capitalism, to the capitalist type of enterprise with its shareholders, its board of directors, its top-down authoritarian structure where the tiny board of directors makes all the decisions that all the other workers have to live with? Is it really an alternative? Because wouldn't a worker's self-directed enterprise also have to live in the market, buy its inputs, sell its outputs, just like a capitalist corporation? And if it's like a capitalist corporation in terms of its buying and selling in the market, then have we really gone to a non- or a capitalist arrangement? I think the best way to answer this is to point out that the question makes a mistake. It has a confusion, and if we clarify the confusion, you'll see that the question answers itself. Here's the confusion. Capitalism is an organization of production. It's not an organization of distribution. Market is an organization of distribution. Market is a way that the goods go from a producer to a consumer. The producer comes and says, I've produced this chair. The consumer says, oh, I would like to have a chair to sit on. And the way the chair gets from the producer to the consumer is a haggling, a bargaining, what we call in economics an exchange process. The consumer gives some money, the producer gives the chair, and if they're satisfied with the amount of money and the chair, the deal is done. So markets accomplish the distribution of goods. But capitalism is about how you organize them, how the production is taken care of. So to call market one thing and production something else means you use the word capitalist for production, not for markets. Let me drive this home another way. Markets have existed when capitalism was nowhere to be seen. For example, in the slave economies, say, for example, the American South. Slaves were bought and sold. The product of slaves' labor, cotton, was bought and sold. So there were markets where these buyings and sellings happened. Slavery in the American South was a market system. It used a market. So you can have a market without capitalism. Similarly, in the feudal manors of medieval Europe, where people were either lords of a manor or serfs. The structure of production was what we call feudalism. Did they have a market? Yes. The products of feudal manors were often sold in markets. The inputs to the feudal manor were often purchased in markets. So you can have a market with capitalism, a market with feudalism, a market with slavery, and so on. Whether a market exists doesn't tell you anything about capitalism. If you want to find whether capitalism exists, you look at the organization of production. In a capitalist system, a tiny group of people, the board of directors and the major shareholders, make all the decisions and gather into their hands the surplus, the profits that the business makes. In a worker self-directed enterprise, it's not capitalistic. There is no division between those who do the work and produce the profits and those who get them and make all the decisions. Because in a worker self-directed enterprise, those are the same people. The workers are their own board of directors. That's why it's a radically different way of organizing. It's not capitalism, because it doesn't have a majority that do the work and a minority that get the surplus or the profits and make the decisions. So, could we have worker self-directed enterprises and a market system? Yes, we could. That doesn't mean that the worker self-directed enterprise is capitalist. It isn't if it is the workers themselves appropriating their own product. Then it isn't capitalist, whether or not it has a market. Last point. People are often confused because some of the greatest critics of capitalism have also been critics of markets. People don't like markets for all kinds of good reasons. Markets are very strange institutions, and I'm going to talk to you about that in future programs. But you have to keep separate the critique of a market and perhaps your suggestion that another way of distributing goods and services would work better. I remember once a story of a Thanksgiving dinner in which a family gathered. And one person around the table was the young college kid who had just come home from college for Thanksgiving, having taken an economics courses and learned how the market is a wonderful institution producing efficiency. So when mother, at the end of the turkey dinner, reached across the table and asked this young man to please take out the garbage, the young man said, "Of course I will do that task, but I want $3 because a market arrangement is the most efficient way to do that." Whereupon his father became outraged and gave him a lecture, said to his son, "What are you talking about? That is an awful thing to say. We don't ask money for one another for the things we do for one another. We do it out of love. You're introducing the market, and it is a threat to the love relationships of doing for one another because we love to, that we've built up over our lifetime. And the kid hung his head. He'd learned a lesson. The market isn't the best way to do things in a lot of situations. And here's a thought for you who are interested, perhaps, in critiques of market. If the introduction of a market arrangement destroys love inside a family, maybe having it in an economy does the same for the love inside a community. But whatever you think about markets, remember, they're one thing about distribution of goods. Capitalism is about the organization of production. They're not the same. I next want to answer a question about the institution of private property. The question is, okay, I can see your criticism of capitalism, but I'm not so keen on getting rid of private property. That seems to me to be very dangerous. So, what do you say, Mr. Wolff? Well, I want to reply. It's like what we just said about markets. Property is one thing, and how you organize production is another. Now, let me give the example of a worker self-directed enterprise. The property of that enterprise, its machines, its vehicles, the building it's in, the inventory it accumulates, all of that is property. But it's an open question, whose property? Workers could self-direct their enterprise even if the property only belonged to some of them. Workers could do it if the property belonged to all of them. Workers could do it if the property belonged to the government, the federal government. They could do it if the property belonged to a local government. They could do it if the property belonged to the church. There are all kinds of arrangements of property. Most societies have all kinds of different arrangements of property. And remember what property is. It's just a law. It's just a rule. Here's what the property rule is. That you are allowed to say to any person in your community that some object, a piece of paper, a coat, a dog, can be denied to you. Property means I can say to you, you can't have access to this thing because it's mine. And by the way, property only works if there's an enforcement. There has to be a system so that if you go ahead and take that dog or take that shirt or take that hamburger, I can call a policeman or somebody to come and enforce the property law, which is if I can show it's mine, I have the right to deny it to you. Worker self-directed enterprises are one thing, property is something else. And by the way, critics of capitalism, critics of private property are not always the same people. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. For example, nobody who's been a critic of capitalism that I know of has been seriously against private personal property. Keep your toothbrush. Keep your shoes. Keep your TV. The question has always been means of production in a community, because there the question of property becomes dicey. Let me give you the starkest example. Suppose there's a community that depends for its survival on food. Most communities do. And food comes from the land. Where else? Well, suppose land is private property. That means an individual, a private owner, or even a group that privately owned it, would have the right, that's what property means, to deny everybody access to their property. But if we all are denied access to the land, we can't grow food and we will die. Most societies confronted with wanting to preserve private property and wanting to avoid death from starvation work out a system that limits, constrains, or eliminates private property because it's inconsistent with community survival and community values. The critique of capitalism is just the extension of that idea when it comes to private property. The argument goes like this. Private property in personal things is, of course, fine. The question is, should we allow factories, machines, land, all the means of producing the goods and services we need to be the private property of anybody. Therefore, to be, at least potentially, withheld from the community. And here people get passionate. After all, those machines were made by working people. Those factories were built by working people. Those stores were stocked by working people. The people together made these things, and even if somehow they became private property, it is unjust to allow anyone in the community to withhold from the community what the community needs to survive. That's a critique of private property. But that's a separate matter, like the critique of markets, from the critique of how you organize production. And worker co-ops, worker self-directed enterprises are, and that's the key point here, ways of organizing production, non-capitalist ways. The critique of capitalism is the critique of one way of organizing production in favor of another. It leaves open to debate and criticism, of course, whether you have worker self-directed enterprise with a market or without a market, with private property in the means of production or not. Those are questions the society will democratically work out. But we have to be clear to keep them separate so we don't confuse them and talk about one thing when we mean another. Last question for the day. Many of you have written to me and asked whether I would say something about the current popularity of critiques of the government. And here's what is meant by these questions. The folks have been kind enough to make it clear to me. In this crisis, now 6 years old, many people see that the ultimate cause of the problem is the government. The government did what it shouldn't do. The government didn't do what it should have done. And there's an interesting collection of very diverse characters who say this. There are anarchists, people who hate the government and always have and organize their understanding and their politics around that. There are traditional conservatives who think that there's too much government in our lives and want that strictly reduced. Some anarchists are typically on the left, the conservatives typically on the right. In the United States, as in many other countries, there's a long tradition of being angry at the government when things go wrong in society. So there's a lot to build on, and it isn't surprising that in this period of extreme economic inequality, suffering, we call it a crisis, we have policies called austerity, hard times. It isn't surprising that there are folks who find their way to the government as the bad guy, the government as the ultimate cause of the problem. I would respectfully disagree. Even if you don't like what the government does, you always have to ask the question, why is it doing that? What are the social forces that push the government this way and that end up having it do what it does? Clearly these days, governments are in the heavy influence of the wealthiest parts of society. That's probably always been true. But as the wealthy become wealthier and fewer in number, their control of what the government does is the problem. And yelling at the government will not likely work if we don't do something about who calls the shots, pays the politician, funds the parties, pumps the airwaves full of material. If we don't deal with that, we're not going to be able to deal with the government. But ultimately, the government isn't the final cause. It's the whole social system. It's the system that we have to finally face and change rather than focusing on this or that detail. Thank you very much for staying with me. This is Richard Wolff, Economic Update. I look forward to speaking with you again next week.